Snow was falling quietly over a small mountain town on Christmas Eve. Lights were glowing, music was playing, and everyone believed nothing bad could happen tonight. But in the middle of that peaceful holiday market, a little girl stood very still, holding a worn reindeer toy, too afraid to speak, too afraid to run. What she did next was almost invisible, just a small movement of her hand, a signal only one being noticed. A police dog who refused to look away. This is a true feeling story about being seen, about courage that does not shout, and about how one quiet moment can change a life forever. Before the story begins, tell us, where are you watching from today? Please leave a comment below. And if stories of hope, love, and quiet miracles matter to you, please press subscribe to support this YouTube channel, so we can keep sharing stories that warm the heart even on the coldest nights. Snow fell steadily over Pine Haven, a small mountain town tucked into the ribs of the Rockies where winter seemed to live year-round and only tolerated summer as a brief visitor. On Christmas Eve, the streets wore garlands like crowns, and every storefront window glowed with warm lights that tried their best to argue with the cold. Wind slid between the pines and lifted powder off rooftops in soft, ghostly swirls. It was the kind of afternoon that made ordinary people believe the world was gentler than it truly was, the kind that convinced them danger would take the holiday off. Officer Daniel Harper did not fully trust that illusion, but he wanted to. Daniel Harper was 34, white, tall enough to stand out in a crowd, yet careful enough to never use it as intimidation. He had a lean, athletic build shaped less by vanity and more by long nights, winter calls, and the quiet discipline of someone who ran to clear his head rather than to be seen. His brown hair was kept short, practical, slightly uneven, as if he cut it himself between shifts. A faint scar angled through one eyebrow, the kind that looked accidental until one noticed how his eyes always measured rooms the way a person measures exits. Those eyes were hazel, steady, and slightly tired in a way that came from responsibility rather than age. He spoke politely even when he didn't feel polite. He had learned years earlier that a calm voice could lower the temperature of a situation faster than a raised one could ever solve it. That lesson had been branded into him on a call he rarely spoke about. A domestic dispute that turned into chaos in a cramped trailer, a child crying, a panicked man reaching, and Daniel making one split-second choice that saved a life, but left him with a lingering respect for how quickly normal could become irreversible. Since then, Daniel had carried gentleness like a tool, not a weakness, something carefully used, deliberately chosen. At his side walked Atlas, a German shepherd who moved as if he had been carved from the same mountain stone that held Pine Haven in place. Atlas was nearly 5 years old, male, large even for his breed, with a powerful chest and a thick sable coat that darkened along the back like a shadow laid on fur. His ears stood sharply upright, always listening, always translating the world into meaning. His eyes were deep brown, intelligent, and unblinking in their attention, with an expression that sometimes made people laugh nervously, as if the dog knew their secrets and was deciding whether they deserved to keep them. Atlas's muzzle carried the faintest dusting of gray, not from age but from the way winter light played on his fur. He was disciplined without looking stiff, confident without being reckless, and he had a peculiar habit that Daniel privately found both amusing and comforting. Atlas tended to glance at Daniel as if reminding him to take his job seriously, like a stern old professor trapped in the body of a dog. Atlas wore a working harness labeled Police K9, fitted snugly across his shoulders. His leash stayed loose. He did not drag Daniel toward smells, greetings, or dropped snacks. In truth, Atlas could have pulled Daniel across the entire market if he wanted to. He simply never needed to prove it. The indoor holiday market was set inside Pine Haven's community hall, a building that smelled faintly of old pine boards, cocoa, and the memory of hundreds of winter gatherings. Strings of warm lights were draped overhead, reflecting off polished ornaments and glass jars filled with peppermint sticks. Vendors lined the aisles with handmade scarves, carved wooden toys, wreaths, soaps shaped like snowflakes, and gingerbread houses carefully iced into miniature villages. Somewhere near the middle, a choir recording played softly through speakers, the kind of music that felt like a blanket even if someone didn't believe in any of the words. Daniel and Atlas moved through the aisles in a slow, familiar circuit. It was part presence, part reassurance. People nodded at Daniel with the easy friendliness of a small town. Some waved, some pretended not to stare at Atlas, then failed. Atlas accepted admiration the way a seasoned professional accepted applause, without reacting, without needing it, without being bothered by it. Near the first aisle stood Marlene Fitch, a vendor in her late 60s, white, short, and round, with a face that looked permanently warmed by ovens and kindness. Her silver hair was pinned in a messy bun beneath a knitted Santa hat. She sold gingerbread houses and had the flour-dusted hands of someone who worked harder than she admitted. Marlene always spoke too loudly when she was happy, and on Christmas Eve she was almost shouting with joy. She leaned over her display, eyes bright. "Officer Harper, Merry Christmas, honey," she called, as if the word Merry was a tangible thing she could toss like a snowball. Daniel smiled, a small one, genuine. "Merry Christmas, Marlene. Smells like you're keeping the whole town fed." Marlene beamed. "Someone has to. You look too thin. I'll fix that." She waved a gingerbread man like a promise. Atlas paused beside the stall, nostrils flaring once, then looked away with the dignity of someone refusing temptation on principle. Daniel chuckled under his breath because Atlas treated snacks like a distraction from sacred duty, and that seriousness was somehow funnier in a holiday market full of glitter and sugar. Daniel kept moving, nodding to other faces. He passed a couple in their 70s bundled in matching green scarves, holding hands like teenagers. A teenage boy with freckles and a Santa apron tried to hand out samples of fudge and nearly dropped the tray when Atlas looked at him. A young mother bounced a baby on her hip and whispered to her child, "That's a hero dog," as if Atlas might understand the compliment and collect it. Atlas did not, or perhaps he did, and simply filed it away under irrelevant. Daniel's radio crackled once with routine chatter, nothing urgent. He answered briefly, then fell back into the market's rhythm. Snow tapped lightly against the tall windows. Outside, the town lights had begun to glow against the gray-white day, and it felt as though Pine Haven itself were holding its breath in a peaceful pause. Daniel wanted to believe in that pause. He wanted to believe that Christmas Eve truly softened people, that it made the reckless cautious and the cruel gentle. He had seen enough good in this town to hope, but Atlas did not patrol with hope. Atlas patrolled with clarity. It happened near a stall of ornaments shaped like reindeer, angels, and tiny cabins with painted smoke curling from their chimneys. Daniel noticed the child only because Atlas's pace changed. Not a dramatic stop, not a bark. Just a subtle slowing, a tightening in the leash that was less a pull and more a question asked in muscle and breath. Daniel felt it instantly. He had learned to read Atlas the way sailors read waves. Atlas's ears angled forward. His body became stiller, as if the air had grown heavier. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and saw her. A girl, about 8 years old, white, small for her age, wrapped in a red winter coat, trimmed with white faux fur that made her look like she belonged in a Christmas postcard. Her dark blonde hair was tucked under a knit hat. A few strands stuck to her forehead, with the damp of indoor warmth meeting outdoor cold. Her cheeks were pink, but not with the flushed happiness of play. They were the pale pink of a child, trying not to cry. She clutched a worn reindeer plush so tightly the fabric wrinkled beneath her fingers. One antler drooped like it had been loved too hard. Her eyes were a muted blue-gray, and they moved in short, careful shifts, the way trapped animals look for openings. Beside her stood a man who, at first glance, could have been any adult in a winter crowd. He was white, mid-30s to early 40s, average height, broad-shouldered in a dark jacket that looked expensive but unremarkable. His hair was brown, neatly kept, his jaw freshly shaved, his posture confident in a practiced way. Chin up, shoulders squared, like someone who wanted to be mistaken for respectable. But the details betrayed him. His hand gripped the girl's wrist too firmly, not protective, not gentle. His eyes did not rest on the ornaments. They flicked toward exits, toward reflections in glass, toward people who looked official. His mouth formed a polite half-smile that never reached his eyes. Atlas took a measured step closer, not aggressive, not frantic, simply certain. The girl's gaze snapped to Atlas with a kind of startled hope that tried to hide itself. Then, as the man leaned forward, pretending to admire an ornament, she lifted her free hand. Palm open, fingers stiff, a tiny motion, careful and deliberate, like a secret knocked on a door. Daniel's heart gave a small, hard thump, because training and instinct both rose at once. He had seen nervous children before. He had seen shy children, tired children, bored children. This was different. This was a child performing silence like a requirement. Atlas did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply shifted his body, angling slightly so that, without being obvious, he was closer to the girl than the man expected. Daniel slowed too, letting the moment breathe. He kept his face neutral, his voice not yet used, because sudden attention could turn a tight situation into a torn one. The man noticed Atlas's proximity and gave a quick laugh that sounded like someone stepping on thin ice. "Easy there," he said, cheerful in a forced way. "She's scared of dogs." The girl shook her head once, barely. Her eyes stayed on Atlas like a lifeline. Daniel crouched slightly, lowering himself so he was less towering, more approachable. His tone softened. "Hey," he said gently, as if he were greeting any child in a market. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" The girl's lips parted. No sound came out. She swallowed, and Daniel saw the tremor in her throat. Atlas let out a low, restrained growl, not loud enough to startle the crowd, but enough to tell Daniel the dog's certainty had become sharpened. The man's grip tightened, and his smile wobbled. Snow kept falling outside, soft and endless, as if the world were trying to cover every footprint before anyone could follow it. Daniel rose a fraction, calm still on his face, but something inside him had shifted into readiness. Atlas stood steady, a dark guardian in a glittering aisle, and the girl's small raised hand lowered slowly back to her plush reindeer, as if she had spent her last coin of courage and was waiting to see if it bought her safety. This chapter ended with Daniel and Atlas poised in that fragile pause. One officer, one dog, one child, and one man whose eyes were already calculating how fast he might have to move. The market's music continued, bright and oblivious, while beneath it a different kind of story began to wake. The pause did not last long, but inside it, everything changed. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows of the market, and Pine Haven's Christmas lights flickered as if blinking against the cold. Daniel Harper straightened just enough to let authority return to his posture without letting tension spill into his voice. He had learned that danger often fed on panic, and this moment needed none. Atlas remained steady at his side, muscles firm beneath his thick sable coat, ears forward, his attention locked on the space between the child and the man, as if the air itself were something that could be guarded. The girl stood frozen, her red coat too bright against the muted browns and greens of the market. Up close, Daniel could see she was thinner than she should have been, not starved, but hollowed in a way that suggested long hours of anxiety. Her boots were mismatched, one lace replaced with a knotted string. The reindeer plush she held smelled faintly of laundry soap and old fabric, the scent of a home that had once been safe. Her eyes never left Atlas now, not even when the man beside her shifted his weight impatiently. The man cleared his throat. "Officer," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "We're just shopping. Kid gets nervous in crowds." He smiled again, and Daniel noticed how the smile arrived before the warmth, like a mask put on in a hurry. The man's hand still clamped around the girl's wrist, not enough to bruise yet, enough to remind her who controlled movement. Daniel nodded once, polite, non-confrontational. "Holiday crowds can do that," he replied. His tone suggested agreement, not challenge. He let his gaze drop briefly to the girl's hand trapped in the man's grip, then back to the man's face. "Mind loosening your hold a bit? You're cutting off circulation." It was a small thing to say. Ordinary, reasonable. That was the point. The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a half-second, calculation flickered across his eyes. He laughed again, louder this time, drawing a few glances from nearby shoppers. "She's dramatic," he said. "Aren't you?" He squeezed the girl's wrist, not harder, but pointedly. The girl flinched. Atlas growled again, low and controlled, the sound vibrating through the leash and into Daniel's hand. It was not the growl of an animal threatening violence. It was the growl of something refusing a lie. Daniel felt the shift ripple outward. A woman at the ornament stall paused mid-reach. A teenage volunteer stopped stacking pamphlets. Marlene Fitch glanced over from her gingerbread table, flour still dusting her hands, her smile fading as she recognized the look on Daniel's face. "Sir," Daniel said more firmly now, I'm going to need you to let go of her." The girl's breath hitched. Her shoulders rose as if bracing for punishment. She leaned forward just enough to whisper, voice thin and shaking, but unmistakably clear. "He's not my dad!" The sentence landed like dropped glass. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. The man reacted instantly. His hand yanked backward, pulling the girl toward the nearest exit, boots skidding against the wet tile as he tried to force momentum. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply ran, believing speed would save him. Atlas moved first. The German Shepherd lunged across the aisle with explosive precision, body low, paws sliding once before gripping traction. He cut off the man's path, planting himself broad and immovable, a living wall of muscle and intent. The man stumbled, momentum broken, grip loosening in surprise. Daniel was already moving. He caught the girl as she stumbled free, pulling her gently but decisively behind him. His arm came around her shoulders, firm and protective, while Atlas held position, teeth bared now, not snapping but promising. "Police!" Daniel called out, voice sharp and clear. "Do not move!" The market erupted into noise. Someone screamed. A display toppled. Phones came out, screens glowing. A middle-aged man near the entrance shouted, "That's her! That's the missing girl! I saw her picture this morning." The words Amber Alert seemed to echo without being spoken aloud. The suspect backed away, eyes darting, hands raised halfway, as if unsure whether surrender or flight would work better. He was sweating now, the cold forgotten. Atlas advanced one measured step, just enough to keep pressure without contact. "Stay where you are," Daniel repeated. His hand rested on the radio at his shoulder, voice calm, as he called for backup. He gave a brief description, location, situation. He did not need to explain urgency. The tone did that for him. The girl trembled against his side, shock setting in now that movement had stopped. She smelled like cold air and fear. Daniel shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, ignoring the sting of chill as it hit his own skin. "You're safe," he said quietly, words meant only for her. "You did exactly right." She nodded once, tears finally spilling, silent and heavy. She clutched the reindeer plush to her chest as if afraid someone might take even that away. Sirens wailed outside, growing louder, threading through Pine Haven's snowy streets. Within minutes, officers poured into the market, weapons lowered but ready, presence filling the space with certainty. The suspect was taken into custody without further struggle, his confidence collapsing into sullen silence as cuffs closed around his wrists. Atlas did not relax until Daniel touched his shoulder and spoke his name. Only then did the dog step back, tail lowering, breathing evening out. His eyes never left the girl until she was seated on a bench, wrapped now in a thermal blanket handed over by a paramedic. The girl sat small and exhausted, knees drawn up, shaking not from cold but from release. A female officer knelt in front of her, introducing herself softly, asking questions with practiced gentleness. The girl answered some. Others she couldn't yet find words for. No one rushed her. When her mother arrived, escorted in by another officer, the market went silent again. The woman was in her early 30s, pale, dark-haired, eyes red-rimmed with terror and sleeplessness. She dropped to her knees the moment she saw her daughter, pulling her close, sobbing into the child's hair. The girl melted into her arms, crying freely now, the kind of cry that comes when fear finally lets go. Daniel stood back, giving them space, Atlas seated beside him like a quiet sentinel. Around them, Pine Haven slowly exhaled. People whispered prayers, some wiped tears. Marlene crossed herself without realizing she had done it. Before leaving, the girl pulled back from her mother's embrace and looked at Atlas. Her eyes were still wet, but something steadier lived behind them now. She reached out, fingers brushing the thick fur at the side of his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." Atlas leaned forward just enough to accept the touch, his tail giving one slow, solemn wag. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of what had almost happened, leaving only light and silence behind. Christmas, it seemed, had not come to Pine Haven loudly that year. It had arrived quietly, in the raised hand of a child and the watchful eyes of a dog who refused to look away. The sirens faded into the snowfall, the way echoes fade in mountains. Not abruptly, but gradually, until the town seemed unsure whether they had ever been there at all. Pine Haven settled back into itself. Christmas lights still glowing, market stalls half-packed, ornaments swaying slightly where hurried hands had brushed them aside. The danger was gone, but its shadow lingered, stretched long across the polished floor and the faces of those who had witnessed it. Officer Daniel Harper stood near the entrance of the community hall, hands resting loosely at his sides, posture relaxed only because it needed to be. Inside him, the adrenaline ebbed slowly, like a tide reluctant to retreat. Atlas sat beside him, harness still on, breath steady, eyes following the movement of medics and officers with professional calm. The German shepherd's tail rested on the floor, thick and still, his body language signaling completion rather than curiosity. The girl remained seated on a bench near the center of the hall, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket that reflected the market lights like faint stars. Up close, her exhaustion showed more clearly now that fear had loosened its grip. Her face was pale beneath the flush of crying, freckles standing out against skin stretched tight with fatigue. Her small shoulders slumped inward, as if her body had not yet learned that it was allowed to take up space again. Her mother sat beside her, one arm wrapped firmly around the child's back, fingers splayed protectively, as if afraid the world might try again to take something precious. The woman, Sarah Collins, as Daniel learned when paperwork began, was 32. White, average height, but carrying herself with the hunched tension of someone who had not slept properly in days. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, strands falling loose around her face, damp with sweat and tears. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed but sharp, darting constantly toward her daughter, as if memorizing proof that she was real and present. Sarah's hands shook when she wasn't touching her child. When she spoke, her voice wavered between gratitude and disbelief, the sound of someone still climbing out of a nightmare. A paramedic knelt nearby, a woman in her 40s with cropped blonde hair and a face that balanced efficiency with kindness. She spoke softly, checking vitals, asking gentle questions, careful never to rush. The girl answered some, shook her head at others. No one pressed. Experience had taught them that survival did not unfold on a schedule. Daniel watched from a respectful distance, letting uniformed presence remain background rather than pressure. He had filled out initial statements, coordinated with backup, ensured the suspect was transported. Now there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting had always been the hardest part. Atlas shifted slightly, leaning his weight closer to Daniel's leg, not seeking reassurance but offering it. Daniel exhaled, slow and deliberate, his hand resting briefly on the dog's head, fingers brushing the coarse fur between Atlas's ears. Around them, the market vendors packed up in subdued silence. Marlene Fitch moved carefully as she stacked her gingerbread houses into boxes, flowers smudged across her sweater like a badge of interrupted joy. She paused more than once to glance at the girl and her mother, eyes shining, lips pressed together as if holding back words that felt too small for the moment. A teenage volunteer swept up broken ornaments, movement slower than necessary, each shard lifted as though it mattered. Pine Haven had not forgotten what it had almost lost. When the girl finally stood, supported on either side by her mother and the paramedic, her legs trembled. Daniel noticed the way she glanced instinctively toward Atlas before taking her first step, as if checking whether the world was still guarded. Atlas met her gaze calmly, his presence unchanged, and the girl nodded to herself, reassured. A detective approached Daniel then, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the lined face of someone who had spent a career listening to things people wished were untrue. He spoke quietly, updating Daniel on next steps, thanking him and Atlas for the intervention. Daniel listened, nodded, answered when needed. His thoughts, however, lingered on the child's raised hand, the stillness before motion, the moment when instinct and training had aligned without question. The girl's mother approached Daniel before they left. Up close, Sarah Collins looked smaller, her earlier tension replaced by a fragile steadiness. She held her daughter's hand tightly, knuckles pale. "Officer Harper," she said, voice thick, "I don't know how to thank you." Her gaze dropped to Atlas, then back to Daniel. "If you hadn't been there—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Daniel shook his head gently. "She did the hardest part," he replied, nodding toward the girl. "She asked for help." The girl looked up at him then, eyes still glossy but clearer now. She hesitated, then stepped forward, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She reached out and rested her small hand against Atlas's neck again, fingers curling into his fur. Atlas remained perfectly still, accepting the touch like a promise kept. "Will he remember me?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled, something warm breaking through the professional calm. "He remembers everyone he protects," he said. That seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, decisively, then turned back to her mother. As they left the market, escorted by officers, snow greeted them outside, falling thicker now, softening edges, erasing tracks. The town lights reflected off the fresh white, Pine Haven wrapped once more in its winter hush. Daniel and Atlas remained behind a moment longer. The market was nearly empty now, decorations dimmed, music silenced. What remained was the echo of what had happened and what had not. Daniel felt the familiar mix of relief and weight settle into his chest. Another call resolved, another life nudged back towards safety, another reminder of how fragile peace could be, even on Christmas Eve. Atlas rose and shook himself, the motion sending a ripple through his thick coat, grounding the moment in something physical and present. He looked up at Daniel, head tilted slightly, as if asking the question he always seemed to ask after work like this. "Are we done here?" Daniel let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured, "we're done." They stepped outside together, boots and paws crunching into fresh snow. Behind them, Pine Haven's lights glowed steadily, unaware that a quiet miracle had already passed through its streets. Ahead of them lay more patrols, more winters, more moments where attention would matter. But for now, the night was calm, the town was safe, and somewhere nearby, a child slept knowing she had been seen. Night settled fully over Pine Haven, with the quiet authority of snow. The last vendor trucks pulled away from the community hall, their taillights briefly staining the falling white with red before disappearing into the mountain dark. Inside, custodial staff moved slowly, folding tables, sweeping footprints that had already softened into memory. Christmas lights were switched off one strand at a time until only the emergency glow remained, faint and practical. Officer Daniel Harper stepped outside, the cold immediately pressing against his face, sharp and clarifying. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds swollen with more snow, the kind that promised a long night and a gentler morning. Atlas walked beside him, boots and paws crunching in sync, their breath rising together in pale clouds. The world felt smaller now, stripped of music and voices, reduced to light, shadow, and the steady fall of white. Daniel did not head home immediately. He never did after calls like this. Instead, he walked the long way through town, following streets he knew by heart. Pine Haven after dark was a different creature, less cheerful, more honest. Storefronts were shuttered, wreaths dimly lit behind glass, nativity scenes half buried in snow. The town did not sleep so much as rest with one eye open. Atlas remained alert but unhurried, his working energy easing into something calmer, deeper. The German Shepherd was no longer scanning for threats. He was listening to the town's breathing. Every so often he glanced up at Daniel, eyes reflective, as if checking in. Daniel returned the look, a silent exchange built over years of trust and shared silence. They passed the small park near Main Street, where snow covered the benches and playground equipment like white linen draped over forgotten furniture. Daniel paused there, resting his hands on his hips, gaze fixed on the empty swings swaying slightly in the wind. He thought of the girl, how small her hand had been against Atlas's fur, how steady her voice had sounded in that one crucial sentence. He had seen bravery before, loud and defiant. This had been different. This had been quiet courage, the kind that blooms only when there is no other choice. Atlas sat beside him, without being told. The dog's age showed more clearly when he was still, the faint stiffness in how he lowered himself, the wisdom in how he conserved motion. 5 years old, seasoned but not old, shaped by training and experience rather than time alone. Daniel knew Atlas's history better than anyone. The dog had been bred for work, trained young, placed with Daniel after his previous handler transferred out following an injury. Atlas had adjusted without drama, as if understanding that partnership was not about loyalty to a person, but to a purpose. That understanding was what made him exceptional. Daniel rubbed his gloved hands together, warmth slow to return. He thought of Sarah Collins and her daughter, now likely wrapped in blankets. He's somewhere safe, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. He wondered what sleep would look like for the girl tonight, whether she would dream of snow, of crowds, of a dark jacket and a tight grip, or of a dog who had seen her when no one else had. The radio at Daniel's shoulder crackled softly with routine updates, nothing urgent. He acknowledged one call, voice calm, then fell silent again. There would be reports, interviews, follow-ups. There would be paperwork heavy with facts that could never fully capture fear. There would be courtrooms and dates circled on calendars. But those were tomorrow's burdens. Tonight belonged to stillness. They resumed walking, turning toward Daniel's small cabin on the edge of town. It sat alone among trees, modest and practical, smoke curling from the chimney where a fire waited to be fed. Daniel had chosen it for its quiet. After his parents passed years earlier in a highway accident that left no room for goodbyes, he had learned that solitude could be a refuge if handled carefully. The job filled the rest. Atlas filled what silence could not. Inside, warmth greeted them. Daniel hung his coat, unhooked Atlas's harness with practiced hands, fingers lingering briefly as if thanking the leather for its service. Atlas shook himself, fur settling, then padded to his water bowl, drinking deeply. Daniel poured coffee he would barely touch, habit more than need, and leaned against the counter, letting the day finally catch up with him. Atlas approached and sat at Daniel's feet, head resting lightly against his knee. It was a small gesture, uncharacteristic of the dog's usual independence. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. He rested his hand on Atlas's head, thumb tracing the familiar line between the ears. "Good work today," he murmured. The words were unnecessary, but said anyway. Later, lying awake as the fire crackled low, Daniel stared at the ceiling, thoughts drifting back to the market. He replayed the moment again and again, not with doubt, but with reflection. The raised hand, the pause, the decision. He understood now that some rescues did not come from force or speed, but from attention, from being present enough to notice the quietest signal in a crowded room. Outside, snow continued its patient work, layering the world anew. Pine Haven slept. Somewhere, a child slept too, perhaps still clutching a reindeer plush, perhaps dreaming of fur and safety. Daniel closed his eyes, letting that image settle, anchoring him against the weight of all the stories that did not end this way. Atlas lifted his head once, ears twitching at a distant sound, then relaxed again, satisfied. Tomorrow would bring new calls, new uncertainties. But tonight, the town held. The line had held. And in that fragile space between danger and peace, something lasting had been carved, not loud enough to be celebrated, but strong enough to endure. Morning came to Pine Haven without announcement. The storm had loosened its grip overnight, leaving behind a pale, overcast sky and a town wrapped in fresh snow that seemed to soften every sound. The streets were already cleared in narrow paths, dark asphalt, cutting through white like careful stitches holding the town together. Christmas had passed, but its presence lingered in wreaths still hanging on doors, lights glowing faintly in windows, and a collective slowness in how people moved, as if no one wanted to rush back into ordinary life just yet. Daniel Harper woke before his alarm, staring at the ceiling of his small cabin as the weight of the previous night settled back into his chest. Some calls faded quickly, filed away as routine. Others stayed, not as doubt, but as memory. He sat up slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, adjusting to the cold, the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace, and the steady breathing of Atlas curled on his mat nearby. Atlas rose the moment Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd moved with practiced efficiency, stiffness just beginning to whisper at the edges of his joints, though never enough to slow him when it mattered. His sable coat caught the dim morning light, revealing flecks of gray that Daniel pretended not to notice too closely. Atlas stretched once, shook himself lightly, and looked at Daniel with calm expectation. Another day, another patrol, life continuing. Daniel brewed coffee more out of habit than need, the bitter smell filling the cabin. He drank only a few sips before setting the mug aside. His phone buzzed on the counter, messages from the department, brief and professional. A note from his sergeant acknowledging the incident, reminding him of paperwork deadlines. Nothing unexpected, no requests for interviews. Pine Haven was not a town that chased attention. They stepped outside together, the cold, sharp, but manageable. The sky was a uniform gray, heavy but peaceful. Snow crunched beneath boots and paws as they headed toward town. Daniel chose to walk rather than drive. He wanted to see Pine Haven in daylight, to confirm that it still existed as it always had, unchanged by how close it had come to something terrible. Near the grocery store, an elderly man worked slowly with a shovel, his movements careful, deliberate. He paused when he saw Daniel and Atlas. "Morning, officer," he said, then hesitated. "About last night. Thank you." He nodded once, as if embarrassed by the weight of the words, and returned to his work. Daniel nodded back. There was nothing to say that would improve on silence. A few blocks farther, Marlene Fitch was unlocking her bakery, a dusting of flour already on her sleeves. She looked tired, but steadier than the night before. "People keep stopping by," she said, voice low, asking if the girl is okay. She shook her head. "Funny how it takes something like that to remind. Folks were all watching the same streets." Daniel glanced at the quiet road. "Maybe that's not such a bad reminder," he said. She smiled faintly. "No, I don't think it is." The community hall stood empty now, its windows dark. The market dismantled as if it had never existed. Snow had erased most footprints, leaving only faint impressions near the entrance. Daniel stopped there for a moment, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He pictured the girl standing still among the stalls, the way her hand had risen almost invisibly. He wondered how that memory would settle inside her, as fear or as proof of her own strength. His phone vibrated again. This time, a message routed through victim support services. "She slept through the night. She keeps asking about the dog." Daniel exhaled slowly, relief spreading through him in a way he had not expected to feel so deeply. Atlas lifted his head, watching Daniel's face with the quiet attentiveness that had become second nature. Daniel knelt and rested his forehead briefly against Atlas's. "She's okay," he murmured. Atlas accepted the words as fact, tail thumping once against the snow. As they walked back, Daniel thought about the things that never made it into official reports. There was no checkbox for intuition, no line item for a dog choosing to slow down at exactly the right moment. No form accounted for the space between action and consequence, the thin margin where everything could have gone wrong and didn't. At the station later that morning, the atmosphere was subdued but steady. Officers exchanged nods, brief comments. No one joked, no one dramatized. They understood that success sometimes looked like absence. No headlines, no funerals, just a child returned home. By afternoon, Daniel returned to his cabin. He fed Atlas, refreshed the fire, and sat in the quiet, letting the day settle. Outside, snow began to fall again, lighter this time, unhurried. Atlas lay stretched out near the hearth, finally allowing himself full rest. Daniel watched the rise and fall of his chest, the simple certainty of it. He thought about time, about how Atlas would one day slow further, about how there would come a last patrol, a final shift. The thought did not frighten him. It reminded him to pay attention now. Somewhere in Pine Haven, a little girl was learning how to sleep without fear. Somewhere, a mother was breathing more easily. The town continued, unchanged in appearance but subtly altered in spirit. Daniel understood then that not all miracles arrived to transform the world. Some arrived simply to hold it steady long enough for someone to be saved. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, Daniel felt the quiet certainty that, for now, everything that needed to be was exactly where it belonged. Winter held Pine Haven gently in the days that followed, as if the town itself had learned how close it had come to losing something irreplaceable. Snow continued to fall in careful layers, smoothing sharp edges, softening sound, asking everyone to slow down whether they wanted to or not. Christmas decorations remained up longer than usual that year. No one rushed to take them down. It felt wrong to hurry anything now. Officer Daniel Harper returned to routine shifts, though nothing about them felt entirely routine anymore. Calls came and went, minor accidents, welfare checks, weather-related assistance. The work was familiar, grounding. Atlas moved at his side as he always had, attentive but calm, his presence a steady line drawn through each day. Yet Daniel noticed that people looked at them differently now, not with awe or spectacle, but with a quiet recognition that carried weight. In the grocery store, an elderly woman paused to pat Atlas's shoulder without asking, tears welling unexpectedly before she could explain herself. At the diner, a man paid Daniel's tab anonymously. At the post office, someone left a handwritten card on the counter, addressed simply to the officer and the dog. Daniel did not open it until later, when he was alone, and when he did, he found no dramatic words, just thanks written carefully, as if the writer had practiced saying it aloud before committing it to paper. Atlas accepted all of it with the same measured dignity he brought to his work. He neither basked nor withdrew. He was unchanged, and that constancy became its own kind of comfort. Daniel realized then that what people responded to was not the drama of what had happened, but the reassurance that something dependable still existed in the world. One afternoon, nearly a week after Christmas, Daniel received a message through official channels asking whether he would be willing to meet with Sarah Collins and her daughter briefly. No press, no statements, just a quiet visit. Daniel read the message twice before answering yes. Atlas, sensing the shift in Daniel's attention, lifted his head, ears tilting. Daniel rested a hand on his back. "We're just saying hello," he said. Atlas's tail thumped once, slow and deliberate. They met at a small park near the edge of town, one Daniel knew well. Snow blanketed the ground, pristine and untouched, except for a narrow path shoveled through the center. The sky was pale, the kind of winter blue that looked fragile enough to crack. Sarah stood near a bench, bundled in a heavy coat, her posture different now, still cautious, but no longer folded inward. She looked like someone learning how to inhabit her own body again. Her daughter stood beside her, smaller than Daniel remembered, bundled in layers that made her resemble a careful stack of winter clothing, more than a child. The reindeer plush was tucked under her arm, one antler still drooping. When she saw Atlas, she froze for half a second, then broke into a shy smile that was more intention than expression. Atlas slowed immediately, body language softening, his approach measured and respectful. He stopped a few feet away and sat, waiting. The girl looked to her mother, who nodded gently. She stepped forward, boots crunching softly in the snow, and reached out. Her hand rested on Atlas's shoulder, fingers curling into his fur with familiarity that surprised even her. "Hi," she said quietly, as if greeting an old friend. Daniel watched from a distance, giving space, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to them. Sarah approached him then, voice low. "She asks about him every day," she said, not apologetic, just honest. She wanted to know if he was real, or if he was something her mind made up to survive. Daniel shook his head. "He's very real," he replied. Sarah let out a breath she had been holding for days. "I don't know how to explain what that moment did for her," she said. "But she sleeps now, and when she wakes up, she believes someone will listen if she speaks." The girl knelt in front of Atlas, careful, deliberate. "You saw me," she said, not a question, but a statement. Atlas leaned forward just enough to touch his nose to her mittened hand, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than affection. The girl smiled then, a small, genuine smile that did not hurry itself. They did not stay long. No one wanted to risk turning something sacred into something ordinary. Before leaving, the girl looked up at Daniel. "If I ever feel scared again," she asked, "can I do this?" She raised her hand, palm open, fingers straight. Daniel nodded, throat tight. "Yes," he said, "and someone will see you." Winter deepened as January settled in. Pine Haven moved forward, as towns do, carrying memory alongside routine. The story spread, softened at the edges, retold without names, without specifics. It became less about what happened and more about what was possible. A reminder passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor. Pay attention, especially when nothing seems wrong. For Daniel, the days returned to their familiar rhythm. He and Atlas trained, patrolled, rested. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel thought about how close the world had come to missing that raised hand. He understood now that not every rescue looked like a chase or a confrontation. Some looked like stillness. Some looked like patience. Some looked like a dog choosing to slow down when everything else urged him to keep moving. Atlas aged as all living things did, though slowly, gracefully. The gray in his fur spread a little more with each season. His movements remained sure, his instincts sharp, but Daniel became more aware of time's quiet insistence. He did not fear it. He simply acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges weather. On one particularly quiet evening, months later, Daniel stood at the edge of town watching snow fall again. Pine Haven, glowing, was softly behind him. Atlas sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Daniel thought of the girl, likely taller now, braver in ways that would never be measured. He thought of Sarah, rebuilding a life interrupted but not destroyed. He thought of the town, of himself, of how fragile and resilient everything could be at once. Somewhere, a child would raise a hand again someday. Not just in Pine Haven, but anywhere fear tried to pass unnoticed. And somewhere, someone, or something, would be paying attention. The snow continued to fall, patient and forgiving. And in that quiet persistence, the miracle endured. Sometimes the greatest miracles of God do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. They arrive quietly through a child brave enough to raise her hand, through a faithful dog who refuses to look away, and through ordinary people who choose to pay attention. This story reminds us that in our daily lives, we are surrounded by quiet signals. A neighbor who grows silent, a child who seems withdrawn, a soul asking for help without words. God often places these moments before us, not to test our strength, but to awaken our compassion. In our own winters of fear, loneliness, or exhaustion, when we feel unseen or forgotten, God is still present, working through kindness, patience, and love, sending help in ways we may not expect. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt. And if you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and healing in every season of life. And please remember to press subscribe and support this YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and quiet miracles with the world.